Dear friends and colleagues, online, in person, dear Jorunn. This is our last lecture for the winter period, and tonight, actually, it's a very different lecture than all the ones we held the last couple of months. It's a long-awaited event, which should have happened during the COVID period and didn't. So tonight is the night that we're presenting the farewell lecture of our former director, Professor Jorunn Økland, from the University of Oslo, who has been at NIA from 2016. I had the pleasure to work with her for at least 4 or 5 years, to the time that the Institute underwent a huge organizational restructuring in 2020, effectuated in 2021. So that was a period that we had been happily collaborating with a lot of new events and a lot of new networks between Norway and Greece, which is the main object, task and goal of the Institute. I know you are familiar with Professor Økland's academic achievements, but I would like to add a few words. Jorunn was educated in classics and religion. She's currently professor at the University of Oslo, and she is affiliated with the Faculty of Theology and the Center for Gender Research. In her teaching, she focuses on religious and philosophical texts, especially texts relating to gender and sexuality, thus the topic of tonight's lecture, which poses an intriguing question: equality in antiquity, did it exist? She's also responsible for a major project on gender equality and hierarchy. And her latest publication revolves around a female French ethnographer of the 19th century by the name of Jean Dieulafoy, who was the excavator of Susa, a writer and an explorer. A warm welcome on behalf of NIA and our colleagues, Paschalis Zafiriadis, Kostas Polizos. Welcome back to NIA Jorunn. Great to see you.
Thank you, Delia. It is really great to be back at NIA again. Very, very nice, and especially since I could not present this lecture during COVID, it is wonderful to have the opportunity to do it now. And since then, of course, I have had more time to think and work. So tonight's topic is, as you said, a result of a long-standing interest in notions of equality in general and its relation to gender in particular. It is a topic one can investigate in many different ways, and at the Center for Gender Research in Oslo, the topic is mostly researched through social science approaches, interviews, observations, statistics, or political science analysis. A question policymakers often want us to explore is how to achieve full gender equality. The question communicates that gender equality is a clear and definable state of society, apparently static, once it has been achieved and not exposed to fluctuation. The idea seems to be that it is so obviously beneficial to all parties involved that once full gender equality has been achieved, there exists no will to return to inequality. These current notions of equality are inextricably linked with a widespread belief in a linear progress of society at large, to be followed by a permanent state when the ideal has been achieved. The general idea has much in common with the Marxist idea of the classless society, a permanent state after class struggle and revolution. In later years, there is more questioning of this assumption about linear progress. We see many social curves descending after periods of stable ascension. There is political unrest, although there is no political project to remove equality, but inequality is on the rise as an effect of other priorities. The gender component of gender equality. Norwegian ideas about gender equality share this assumption about linear progress, the continuous expansion of equality, increase of equality, who should be included and protected among the group of gender equals. Not just cisgendered, heterosexual women and men, but gradually also further genders and sexualities. However, we also see that the continuous expansion of what the gender part of gender equality is supposed to include is not a unidirectional process either, and there is a question of level. Laws can state equal rights for homo and heterosexuals, while socially, trans people, gays and lesbians will still be vulnerable to physical violence and exclusion in society. Material social practices. I have approached the history of equality as the history of a concept, as an idea or value, and as a possible social material practice. And when investigating the social material practice, for the ancient Greek context, one mostly finds inequality. That is not news, and the more material side of my work ties more into how we can imagine the non-elite people of ancient Greece from material remains and not just analyze the sprawling remains of the elite. So since this was planned as a farewell lecture, I am also trying to kind of display some links to the other parts of my research. So there will be a few of those, but just so that you will see where I'm coming from when I discuss this. So those attending my lecture at the Swedish Institute in the autumn on what kind of people would fill up the vast ancient Corinthian amphitheater will have gotten to know a bunch of workers and visitors there who were less equal than others, less equal than the Athenian men we will give much focus today. So this is of course a reference to Animal Farm by George Orwell, which a famous quote has, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And during the work of this, for this paper, that just comes across as very, very true. This quote captures exactly the limits of equality, which I will explore. Those who were more equal than others, both in Animal Farm and in Athens, were clearly the in-group, in themselves elite. Similar studies of social and material practices of equality and inequality in ancient Greece are on the increase. One close example is the volume Corinthian Contrast, Studies in Inequality from 2014 and edited by Stephen Friesen, Sarah James and Daniel Showalter. In many ways, this paper will discuss, and now I have forgotten completely to, I have just been reading my manuscript. Yeah. So, there we go. Yes. And here is the amphitheater I mentioned. This is not, this is outside of the city center, more or less at the crossroads where the roads from the various harbor cities meet. Animal Farm, sorry about this. And here is the book that I was just referring to. Yeah, okay. In many ways, this paper will discuss something that is missing in that volume, a discussion of the historical notions of equality and inequality themselves. Maybe what put me onto this trajectory were the frequently repeated references to ancient Athens as a cradle of democracy and to earliest Christianity as a society of equals. I have been critical to both of these characterizations. By the way, I consider Christianity as a religion that emerged in the Greco-Roman world, so I have never understood why it shouldn't be studied as part and parcel of Greco-Roman religion. Both of them take a current ideal or value, democracy and equality respectively, and locate them in a particular historical social unit. This social unit may even be described as the matrix or origin of the ideal or value in question. By modern standards, even the short-lived full democracy of ancient Athens was one of radical inequality, with the exclusion of women, slaves, and most foreigners from the assembly of citizens. Access into the community of full citizens, or equals, was strictly regulated, and most Athenians did not qualify. Some scholars contrast the Athenian assembly to the later Christian ecclesiae, which were open to women and slaves and brought together people from different geographical areas. And I will return to that. Which equality? With so many different notions of equality circulating in the present, by which notion should the ancient Athenian assembly be judged as radically unequal and the Christian assembly as equal? By ancient standards, the Athenian equality experiment with direct democracy was considered so radical and therefore so vulnerable that it ended up being rather short-lived for that reason. Not least, any notion of ancient equality that we can trace will look different from the bottom of the hierarchy and from above. When in doubt, ask those on the bottom. This is another reason why I have remained focused on the earliest Christian letters. They offer a rare glimpse, a written glimpse, into a non-elite segment of Roman colonial societies. The paradox is that the Christian assembly may have survived exactly because it very quickly developed into a hierarchical structure that could survive the centuries. As a historical irony. Methodological considerations. Inevitably, we have to use our modern conceptions when we analyze the past, but we have to be very conscious about it, since also our analytical tools come to us with a history of their own. I have found conceptual history a very useful approach that demonstrates how differently, for example, a concept like equality has been understood in different periods. And you will get to meet that again. Various notions of equality intersect with various notions of gender in the ancient Greek-speaking world. So my talk tonight is part of a large canvas. There were very different notions of gender compared to now, and I previously have traced 5 different etiologies or models of gender at work in Greek literature, or other figurative art. What unites them is gender hierarchy, but notions of equality or sameness are also a factor. So when I talk about intersecting notions of gender and equality, the intersections vary according to which model of gender intersects with which notion of equality or inequality. So it's kind of a 2-axis system. So it's like you have 2 axes here, and you can imagine the various combinations of very various points here. So this just to if you want to place gender equality on an axis here, you just have to see that there are very, very many possibilities of combining those two terms. I talk about the concept of equality as the main object of historical analysis. Conceptual history takes as its point of departure the idea that concepts are not stable and addresses the historical side of language rather than relying on stable meanings of terms and concepts that can be applied to historical data. Since equality is a concept that is also highly value charged in the present, the value side cannot be ignored. The editor of Der Neue Pauli, Huber Kankik's work on conceptual histories in religion and classics, constitute a reference point. Kankik's essay Gleichheit und Freiheit engages broadly with the ancient world and addresses early Christianity throughout as the vehicle by which ancient concepts were transported and translated into medieval and even modern Europe. Although another work by Kankik's, his Handbuch religionswissenschaftlicher Grundbegriffe, does not include an entry on Gleichheit, issues often discussed under the rubric of equality are instead discussed under that of Klassengesellschaft, so class society. Another scholar, Kippenberg, borrows the tools of this conceptual history, not least the distinction between proposition and description. So he points out that equality is a hope of a paradisic condition that has either remained wishful thinking or inspired collective action. So to this, I started talking about how it's often in the Norwegian policy context considered as a state that one has to work towards achieving, and when you have achieved it, it's like you're there and it's okay. But There are many alternative ways of seeing it. A final important feature of the conceptual historical method is that it analyzes the intertwining of conceptual categories and historical materialities. In the case of equality or equal rights, the question of the concept also implicates members of a concrete social corpus, their material resources and their language. Thus, investigation must combine philology, philosophy and materialist history. This intertwining means that the approach does not depend on the concept per se, accurately summing up any existing facts on the ground. Judith Butler's recent analysis of radical equality helps us better grasp how equality as a multifaceted concept needs specification, which in turn awakens appreciation for how the concept of equality itself has changed over time. She says, equality cannot be reduced to a calculus that accords each abstract person the same value, since the equality of persons has now to be thought precisely in terms of social interdependency. So though it is true that each person should be treated equally, equal treatment is not possible outside of a social organization of life in which material resources, food distribution, housing, work and infrastructure seek to achieve equal conditions of livability. Reference to such equal conditions of livability is therefore essential to the determination of equality in any substantive sense of the term. Butler's equality of result approach finds deep resonance in some of the ancient sources. For example, then the letters of Paul and Paul's concern for the weak and those without knowledge or without food. Although he uses hierarchical rather than equality language to deal with these cases, which means that the strong should care for the weak, the wise should care for the fools, and the haves should care for the have-nots. Thus, strictly speaking, he confirms hierarchy reversal rather than equality, and those are not the same thing. But his aim too seems to be livability for all. And then we will move on to, let me see. Yeah, here was the front page of Butler's book. Yeah, go back there. So now more onto the conceptual history. Equality is a concept with a long history of constant recharging. Its definition, uses, relationship to other concepts, and translation into other cultural and linguistic domains have varied over time. In fact, the term equality is in itself a late translation, developed from the Latin root equo, documented in ancient Latin inscriptions and literature. Over the last generation, it has also become more common to use the term equity in English-speaking gender-critical contexts. To distinguish between equality and equity, equality refers to the qualitative side of the Greek term isotes, and equity to its quantitative and arithmetic side. Since the mid-19th century, my mother tongue Norwegian has distinguished between likhet, equality, and likestilling, which is more equity. The latter term, likestilling means to put various social and political, to put entities side by side to create a level surface across their differences. The term was originally coined to prescribe shared legal status of two Norwegian languages. They should be likestilt and have the same official status. Soon the term was adopted by feminists and operationalized politically to prescribe a new relation between women and men. And today the term refers to the leveling of all sorts of differences, whether language, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, ability, and so on, in order to achieve equality of result. Since there is no terminological distinction in ancient Greek, the distinction of quantitative and qualitative is itself a matter of philosophical discussion. I will use equality as the English translation with the ancient Greek ambiguity intact. Isotes, equality in early modern Europe. In the early modern period, antiquity's radical notions of thinking isotes or equality were resuscitated and developed further under the new influence of the science of mathematics. So I'm now doing a conceptual history. So we start in the present and we are moving back. So I have talked about the modern period, and now we are early modern Europe. In their eagerness to be scientific, early modern philosophers borrowed concepts from the booming natural sciences, as Ingeborg Ovesen has recently shown. Ovesen demonstrates how the route from one discipline to another was shorter than now, resulting in an advance for the more quantitative understanding of equality, which in turn paved the way for the modern understanding of gender equality, according to which women and men can be equal even if they are not the same. Robert Record, the inventor of the equal sign in mathematics, was also a physician. Similarly, Descartes and John Locke were both scientists and philosophers. As Ovesen states, the present Berlin Wall between the humanities and the natural sciences did not exist in the 17th century. Thus, the shift in collective consciousness that gave rise to feminism and the liberation of women originates perhaps from mathematics. The equal sign, here I have marked, so these two lines, the equal sign, traveled during early modernity into social and political philosophy, where it influenced French language, in which the Enlightenment democratic ideals were most poignantly formulated as liberté, égalité, fraternité. Since then, equality has been a progressive social ideal. That being said, women were not considered citizens by Rousseau, whose thought was one of the revolution's inspirations, nor did they become citizens from the outset in the revolution's aftermath. This demonstrates, again, how the value of equality usually operates within a closer defined group. Only group definitions change. Isotes in ancient Greece. Generally, scholars on ancient notions of gender and sexuality have pointed out that ancient Greeks found it impossible to think of two persons without immediately conceptualizing them as a hierarchy in some sense. The same applied even to parts, fluids, etc., in or on the same human body. Yet terms that are often translated equality in modern English did exist, and one of them is isotes. The entry point to the ancient world in this lecture, though, is this concept of isotes. How inclusive was it? What characterized the social corpus within which the members should be equal? Foregrounding gender equality, analysis of gender and sexuality relating to equality will be presented first. A database search, for example Theology, reveals that the term isotes occurs most frequently in Plutarch, who was a near contemporary to Paul of Tarsus. It also occurs in some writings by Stoic philosophers and in the corpora of Plato and Aristotle. Here I will go back to the latter's texts, since in the history of the concept, the earlier period must also be represented. I emphasize again that in this longer history of a modern politically charged concept, neither Paul nor Plato nor Aristotle are fixed reference points. They are episodes in a longer history that is important from a modern perspective. However, it is my conviction that we might understand some of these ancient authors' take on isotes and ideas of community better when they are allowed to occupy this place within a long history. So the most common terminology, and thus today given an aura of originality, is derived from the Greek root isos, which is the isos or isi, ison. I will survey a couple of representative uses of isotes before turning to the concept's reception in the body of literature, through which ancient Greek terms and concepts were most widely disseminated in Europe, namely also the early Christian literature. The representative cases there are drawn from Pauline literature. But first, within the discussion of imitative art and how it produces likenesses to a charming original, Plato has an Athenian say. So I have here, I will read it in English, but then those of you who are interested in the Greek can see it on the screen. The correctness of these things would primarily be brought about by equality, both quantitatively and qualitatively speaking, and not by pleasure. I mentioned above that there is no terminological distinction in ancient Greek between qualitative and quantitative equality. Rather, the qualitative distinction is a matter of philosophical discussion of the concept isotes itself. This quote illustrates this point, thus proving the continuity between the modern, comprehensive, liberal philosophical theory of justice, on which modern theories of gender equality and other equalities are based, and the ancient, slightly unsystematic materials, which is approximately similar to the continuity between modern religious dogmas and ancient, slightly unsystematic religious materials. The ancients were not analytic philosophers in the modern sense. Note also the abstract notions of sameness in quality, so prevalent in ancient Greek thought on conditions for equality. Among the criteria for evaluating imitative arts are both correctness and so orthotes and pleasure, hedone. It is isotes, equality, with the original in both quantity and quality, that produces correctness. That is, in the relation between the object of art and what it represents. An object that produces neither usefulness, nor truth, nor homoiotes can still be judged by the criterion of pleasure. It is interesting that the term homoiotes, likeness or sameness, occurs nearby in this context. This conglomerate of closely related words, we also have the technai ekastikai here, the figurative art, that these are all reminiscent of both the creation story of the human in the Greek version of Genesis, so there you have eikon and homoiotes, and Paul's reference to it in a chapter in 1 Corinthians where he talks about the relation of women and men. It is also interesting that isotes turns up in the same context, and just as the fine distinctions between the terms occurring in the creation stories in Genesis have been discussed since antiquity, the distinctions between isotes and homoiotes continue to fascinate modern thinkers. What is clear within this aesthetic theory, however, is that the equality the Athenian talks about here has little to do with human rights or legal and social status, which are the contexts in which we often discuss equality today. A modern human rights lawyer would answer no if asked whether equality is dependent on identity and likeness with a normative original. In this sample, only equality regarding quantity and quality can produce a correct likeness. Another fascinating example is found in Phaedrus. I think that equality of age leads them to similar pleasures, and through likeness produces friendship. The passage addresses the connection between sexual erotic pleasure and friendship between men who are similar in age, quantity, and sex, quality. Again, the criteria of quantity and quality plays a role. Likeness, homoiotes, engenders filial love, and proximity in age ensures common preferences regarding pleasure. The various layers of friendship between men is what Phaedrus is about. Women are out of the picture in its vision of equality, likeness, and love. Next, Aristotle's work Politica is usually translated politics, but it could also be translated civil society, since the society in which he formed his theories had no real distinctions between politics, culture, and civil society. The central topic is how a social community should be run and governed. And the quote goes, "The good in the political field is justice. That means the common good. It is therefore thought by all that justice is some sort of equality. Up to a certain point, at all events, they agree with the philosophical discourses in which it has been established regarding the ethical questions, what justice is and for whom. What they say that it is to give to the equals what is equal. But equality in which characteristics, respects, and inequality in which? It is important not to forget this question." This long and dense quote from an important passage contains many issues that are relevant in our context. First, it demonstrates that the same preoccupation as the above quote from Laws by Plato, that in that the quality and quantity of likeness or identity are the basis for equality. Second, Aristotle brings another element into the discussion. Promoting his own political philosophy, he ties equality closely up to to dikaion, the just, which I, following mainstream translations, have translated justice. And hence the dike relief on the poster for this lecture, with two equally balanced weights in her hand. It has been suggested, by the way, some of you may know that this may also represent Themis. Just like the statue at the National Archaeological Museum is, some think it's Poseidon and others think it's Zeus. So also with this one, but I take it to be Dike for the purposes of this lecture today. Third, the statement, "It is therefore thought by all that justice is some sort of equality," gives an important ancient precedent of the modern secular idea that gender equality and gender justice are intimately connected, and if there is no structure securing justice, it is difficult to ascertain equality. In the politics culture civil society organism Aristotle imagines, there is a cycle between ethical and political issues, philosophy, lawmaking, and the running of the city-state. These were not the developed academic disciplines separated, as they are today, but rather topics for common reflection and discussion among citizen peers. Equality is discussed within this context and thus always predefined by the laws regulating issues of gender, country of origin, self-ownership, slave or free, and economy. Aristotle goes on to present a hypothetical counterexample in which some suggests that state offices should be distributed unequally, anisos, on the basis of superior merits, qualities, and so on. Even if the candidates in all other respects did not differ at all, but happened to be exactly alike, homoia, for among those who are different, have different rights and merits, just is something else than what is according to worth. Aristotle rejects this hypothetical scenario, resembling the meritocracy that our current world holds up as ideal, since it means that those who have a superior quality of some kind will be able to take political advantage of it. He concludes brutally through the use of several comparative examples, particularly one regarding flute players. Should the best flutes be given to the best-looking flutist? It would make as little sense to give the highest political offices to those who have accumulated wealth, who come from good families or have good stature, as it would make little sense to give the best flute to the best-looking flutist, rather than to the superior performers, he argues. So the question is, for what purpose? So things have to fit purpose. The basis on which Aristotle can present this example as ridiculous is the democratic template, where offices are distributed through ballot. Incompetent citizens will inevitably hold high offices, but they can only stay for a year. And the citizens will inevitably be free men anyway. Next in our conceptual history, we turn to Plutarch, the late 1st century philosopher who wrote many books as commentaries or reflections on previously published works. In his Precepts of Statecraft, he comments on Euripides, who chanted. He chanted because the tragedies were written in rhythmic prose. So Euripides chants, he doesn't write tragedies. Approvingly, regarding the man who spent sleepless nights restlessly hanging around another mightier man's court and subjecting himself to sexual intercourse with a mightier head of tribe or land. This might be the most noble way to proceed for the sake of his native land, but otherwise he should welcome and preserve the friendships based on equality and justice. Plutarch finds that, in general, Euripides' tragedy too primarily recommends friendship based on equality and justice. But in contrast to the tragedy, Plutarch does not find it recommendable to make this exception for a statesman submitting to a mightier one. There is no reason to further humble his native state by subjecting the neck to the yoke, as some do. Friendship is different from networking and statesmanship. Only in the latter case, statesmanship, may it be good advice to lay back and think of England, to use a modern colloquialism. For friendship, equality and justice are constitutive elements. Thus, for Plutarch, friendship can only occur between people on the same level. Thus, we may begin to approach why there cannot be gender equality within this ancient political system. Wives would, as a rule in ancient Athens, have to lie back and think of Athens. The Hetairae could at best be viewed as women running their own business, still without the rights and material resources to manifest themselves as equal with property-owning, free male Athenians. There was no legal material structure for a genuinely equal friendship between a man and a woman in the way we today understand equality as something that is level, be it the playing field or the result. One final example to discuss is recognizable content-wise from Plato, but quoted from pseudo-Plutarch on monarchy, democracy and oligarchy, because it confirms knowledge of Plato's views on equality during a later period in time. So it demonstrates that these ideas remained. A kingdom gives birth to hybris, violence, and to the irresponsible. Oligarchy breeds arrogance and stubbornness. Democracy breeds anarchy, equality, and out-of-bounds behavior. In sum, all of them breed folly. In the presentation of the three main forms of government and their respective pitfalls, the problem with democracy is that it breeds equality, anarchy, and leveling. Equality is a danger and part of the chaos that ensues when you give citizens the power in a true democracy. It is interesting that this chart is repeated as authoritative in a later period when the type of direct democracy Athens once had no longer existed. To summarize, this short and very, very quick survey, I apologize, makes clear that there was a concept of equality in ancient Athens between free men who were already eligible to hold offices in the city-state. In Plutarch's period of emperors and kings, it was relevant to discuss whether a statesman would have to submit sexually to a mightier king or head of state. He recommends not to put the neck under the yoke, while wives and slaves had to do so, even if they might be seen as equal inside their own respective groups. But we cannot know for certain, for the male citizens who wrote were less interested in them. The development of the democracy in ancient Athens started with the organization of courts, so that jurors and judges were chosen from Athenian free men. Cleisthenes' reform, 507 BCE, assigned all Athenians to fili in control of citizenship with its military, political and social implications. This notion of politeia, citizenship, created a semblance of equality among the free men who belonged to their file, and was foundational for the ecclesia, the assembly, in the Greek civic context. In spite of the semblance of equality, differences in wealth had the implication that some were more equal than others, to put it with Orwell again, in the sense that some had more opportunities to exercise their citizen rights and opportunities, while poorer citizens were in practice barred from participation, even if they had the same rights in theory. Since this was seen as weakening the strength of the democracy in its military, political and social implications, the Periclean reform of the 5th century BCE ensured that citizens were paid to serve the public in council, assembly and juries. I just have to check the time. Okay. The term, so now we are moving over to the Christian literature. The term Isotus and the related word Isos figure in Pauline literature only on a few occasions. But other terms he uses could in theory at least imply some level of what we today call equal worth between inhabitants or members of a group. For example, terms for unity and community, such as the key Pauline term ecclesia. And recently this has been proposed that this is some kind of a term implying equality. And in a longer version of this paper, I discussed this particular issue, but I will try to do it brief today. But it is a question of whether Paul implies equality in his use of the term ecclesia or not. But again, a quote we can, oh no, what has happened here? Oh. Okay, so I'll just have to, the other quotes work well, but this clearly, it worked on my computer, but not on this one. Okay. Not so that there should be relief for others while for you pressure, but out of equality between your present abundance and their deprivation, so that also their abundance may be there for your deprivation, in order that there may be equality. As it is written, the one who had much did not have too much, and the one who had little did not have too little. The official Norwegian translation has likhet for isotus in this quote, but it is very difficult to see that it says isotus here, since it's all muddled up now. However, given the built-in ambiguity of translations, denoting both equilibrium and similarity, the main English translation has fair balance, which grasps the nuance of isotus here well. The text is about quantitative equality of result between economic and social classes, rich and poor, inside the assembly. This confirms the issue raised in the introduction, that the concept of isotus, some sort of equality making, was operative. Is operative inside groups, inside particular groups. Similarly, we see in the pseudo-Pauline letter to the Colossians, which may then also be muddled up. Yes, I'm very sorry about this. You masters provide justice and equality to your slaves, knowing that also you have a master in heaven. As in Aristotle, justice and equality are linked. The text further uses the same expression, to dikaion, the just, rather than the noun, as we saw in Aristotle. For both of these examples, the older and more tradition-bound translations use the English equal for isotus, whereas the usually more progressive, more recent one has fair. In the case of the latter quote here, treating slaves with justice and equality would have been far more progressive in the ancient world. Although it is not clear how the author understands the justice-related basis for equality of slaves, this is in many ways a bit surprising. Again, since it is written to an assembly, there are different rules about the relationships between masters and slaves inside the assembly than outside. And since the slave remains a slave, there is nothing here that indicates that slaves should be given freedom. The masters should provide for the slaves, so that the masters can expect fair treatment by their master in heaven. I have a few more examples, but we are running a bit out of time, so I will jump a little bit. Yeah. So for this is enough to state that a concept of equality not only existed in the linguistic world of ancient Greek, but also had a designated term and was continuously discussed. So we have seen now examples from many centuries of antiquity, and then also, as the conceptual history goes, also from early modern and modern period. But surprisingly, from a modern perspective, notions of equality and notions of gender were unconnected except when it came to sex and friendship between men, and not between women or between the sexes. Authors such as Pseudo-Plutarch and Plato describe the filial and sexual intimacy between men of the same age and equal rank as the clearest example of equality. These texts, in my opinion, challenge the view that in antiquity sex had to involve hierarchy, and that any sex that did not involve hierarchy, for example between women, was seen as unnatural and punishable, as Bernadette Bruton has argued most persuasively. In her view, the fundamental active-passive dichotomy within the sexual semantics of antiquity, combined with a negative view of women in general, led to the condemnation of love and sex between women. The material presented here calls for a nuancing of this view. Not all sex between men was normatively hierarchical, and there was a designated positive term for describing sexual mutuality based on equality between male partners. The volume, Feminism and Ancient Philosophy, discusses which, if any, of the ancient philosophers introduces topics of gender, equality, and justice. Most of its contributors discuss and qualify notions of equality, and then go on to answer in the negative, along a very wide sliding scale. Catherine Gardner points to Plato's Republic as the first systematic account of sex equality, where he argues that equal work and education for women are part of the requirements of the ideal state. But among the occurrences of isotes in Plato's writings, none of them occur in Book 5 of the Republic, where he writes on the guardians. Julia Annas, who had studied this part of the Republic in detail, argued that any education and relief of women from the reproductive tasks there is due to a purely utilitarian approach to the state and not due to a concern for women's equality or rights. Furthermore, it is a utopian text. There is nothing in Republic 5 which would commit Plato to the view that it was unjust for 4th century Athenian women to be treated as they were, she says. And in another discussion of Paul, Plato's Republic and Anna's interpretation, Kari Nuttall adds, while there are some women who are better at some things than some men, as a group, women are weaker and far surpassed by men. The rationale for having both male and female guardians is thus not based on gender equality, but rather on inequality. Gender equality in a modern sense, supported by formal justice, women's rights, citizenship, and so on, was not part of the discussions of equality in ancient Greece, as we have seen. At the same time, there are traces, not least in the early Christian materials, of values and ethics of mutual care, of women running their own businesses and leading, sponsoring, and speaking in the assemblies. None of these phenomena presuppose equality, and Paul does not use the Esos terminology much either, although we have seen some examples. As Stanley Stowers reminds us, no one is served with confused concepts and terminologies, and the current paper's strict focus on the concept, but with side glances towards traces of values, ethics, and practices of care that might diminish hierarchical divides, is greatly helped by Stowers' precisions. It is time to close, the quote, "all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others," is also popular in its Norwegian translation, and it is often associated with the inner circles of the Norwegian Labour Party and its workings in the post-World War II period. But also in contemporary Norway practices the Orwellian type of equality and gender equality, not dissimilar to how ancient Athenian men understood themselves as equal, or how pigs in the animal farm did. Equality can only exist within a limited group. Norway's strive for gender equality is dependent on firm national borders, and both times there have been referendums on joining the EU, the conclusion has been negative because of the vote of Norwegian women. Statistics show that while men as a group were in favor of joining, women as a group were against. They feared losing rights that they had fought so hard for. I think the result might have been different today, but let's not go into that. But it's a curiosity, it's an interesting example. That equality among Norwegians has been dependent on firm national borders has also been reflected in attitudes in academia. Female academics were for a while negative to internationalization, since it may have as consequence that non-Norwegian male academics who do not have to do their share in child-rearing have a competitive advantage when they apply for posts in Norway. The interesting twist here is that what has happened instead is that foreign female academics quickly found Norwegian academia hugely attractive for exactly the same gender-inclusive policies. So, can some animals be more equal than others? What saves this expression from being meaningless is the fact that the pigs do consider themselves equals among themselves. They are allowed to behave like humans, but other animals who are put to work on the farm and given barely enough food to live on are not equal to the pigs. So maybe you get the conclusion that equality has a very long history, and it can be placed on many points on this on an axis system. But both today and in antiquity and in most times in between, it has always been held as a value and as an ideal within a clearly defined group. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Økland, for this very impressive and dense lecture. And if I may ask, is it published somewhere, or is it going to appear?
I'm sorry, I got some. So it will be published here.
Good.
Yeah.
Questions, comments?
What about the theory in antiquity that women should dominate men? You know, there is this ideology which is in the Ecclesiastes of Aristophanes. We have also several titles of comedies entitled Gynecocratia, especially of the Middle Attic comedy. And we have the information by the pseudo-Skymnos that there were laoi gynecocratumeni around the Palus Meiotis, that is about around the Azov Sea, probably related to the Amazons. How would you fit this notion in your frame, if I may ask?
Yeah. Very interesting question, so thank you for that. This topic, and it is, as you say, it is a but it is a frequently recurring topic, and in many ways, since it takes place in comedy, which was performed within the city-state, which was a male democracy, you could say. It was the comedy gave space for joking, and then this was considered like a funny thought experiment, and everyone who has seen some of these comedies performed live today will know what I'm talking about. But also that the theory of the societies like the Amazons or close to the Amazons, that's a different social function, and it's not comedy. It's something different, and that also existed. I think it is. I read some of those examples as examples of kind of us and them. It's different from us. We are here and we write this and we talk about them, and for this reason I have tried to follow much of the to see, because sometimes we have found the Amazons, we have found like a Gynecocratia, and for me the most important thing is not whether you find those societies or not, but that it remained. It's interesting. It remained a thought, maybe not just a thought experiments. Maybe there were connections. Maybe, but it was constantly held as a possibility, and I think that had a generative function within the society of the city-states where the citizens were males, and that could have a function on a number of different levels. But I would not say that, oh, it was just the Amazons, it's just a male fantasy that creates fear. I wouldn't say that. I mean, it could be that too, but I think it's much more interesting than that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I had like one observation and one question. I wrote it down. I don't forget. So one was the observation kind of observation question. So on the previous passage which you just showed to us, and then I remembered the symposium, radio symposium, and Pausania's speech in the symposium, and how, from what I remember from the like 3 months or so, I hope I remember something, about how men and women should be together because they can't show weakness to each other. They're equal because if they show weakness to the other person, which means the other person is going to dominate them. And now consider this. So I remember the symposium happened in the late stage of Plato's career, I think, and Republic and Phaedrus happened before. So can we say that due to the passage of time, Plato's own opinions, his own personal opinions on this matter would have changed? It is natural. Like I wasn't the same person taught on gender equality, for example, 3 years ago. I have different opinions now. And it was there for 70, 80 years, I don't know. So these opinions should have changed, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm not a Plato specialist, but what I have read up on the topic for these and other purposes are very, very interested in exactly your question and how his views, because we also have, since he was such an important author, we have preserved so much of what he has said. So again, I'm careful not to say he has written so much, because probably there are so many writers who have written much more, but they were not, they were not part of the social community. So in a way, I'm thinking everything from inside the community, the democracy as a kind of social organism, and he was kind of an ideologue, and so the works were preserved, and they do, whether scholars argue about this development, and especially, or at least especially what I read in terms of gender, and that what he says in the laws is very different, from other writings. But also, I think that maybe you can construct a linear development, but I would be careful with a linear development. But I also think that he may try out different ideas in the different writings. But what I do think is very important is to notice, exactly as you do, that there are different views and different models in the different writings. And some of the scholars I quoted are, for example, discussing laws, where he on the one hand seems to give very prominent or responsible roles to women. We're kind of quick to say that, well, but it's not necessarily equality like that. It's not independence, but at least it's not the same all the time. It's different facets. That's something how I would put it. So it's not just maturation, but exploring different facets in the different writings.
Any comments or views, questions?
One more part, right? Like you just said, one of the Paul's speeches, he said that, the masters should treat the workers well because they should expect good things from the master above God. Is this idea of, say, I have a master or some greatly singular one person, highlight one person in the top, affects somehow the structure and the writings of later Christian and Abrahamic faiths. Now, I can say this because when we ransom, we have I hope, we have like very multifaceted, multi-dimensional concept religion, and for me it is interesting that they have one person in the top, and we expect to go to one person and then see, because he will treat you harshly if you treat people under you harshly, and that affected your right, the people on that time, the preachers and stuff, to give a solidified hierarchical structure to mimic the person above, to mimic God, isn't it? Is this can this be linked to religion and the way we identify God as a person, religion, and writing? Can it link be done?
I mean, it's a large question for the kind of discussion of this concept, but I think that what you then bring in is that even if we find the term Isos or Isotes also in Paul's writings, they occur within a larger context where there is also a very, very strong hierarchy involved. So Paul does call himself the slave of Christ as a way of humbling himself, and so of course that involves a hierarchy, and maybe when I said to begin with that the historical irony is that you know, the Christian assemblies that took the term ecclesia, which was, you know, from the ancient democratic vocabulary, and borrowed also other aspects of that ancient democratic vocabulary and practices. And that, I'm sorry, this is the part that I have to skip much of now in order not to go on all night. But this maybe was the key to the earliest success. So I mean, this is kind of my theory, that I think that this was the key to early success. But then, in order for this sudden success to survive, it very, very quickly developed into a very hierarchical fixed system that could be continued for century after century. Oh.
Thanks very much for this lecture. I wanted to ask you if you had gone further back in terms of understanding the development of inequality between men and women, or and by this I mean Homer Hesiod. I think it's interesting in terms of what you're presenting, that there we have a progression towards inequality. From the respected autonomous women presented in Homer, although subservient to men, but nevertheless characters in their own right, to the subservient woman in Hesiod, and the development of Pandora and the whole myth of essentially women not being part of the human race. And then moving towards the laws of Solon, which restrict women's presence in the city, and their public presence in the city, and the institutionalized writing out of women from isonomia isopolite, which was much more in the minds of the lawmakers at the time than Isotis, right?
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you had looked, if you had traced it, going back, moving forward from there, and how your views how you read this into the.
Yeah. Thank you for. You know, this is a very large question, and the thing, I have looked at it, but I feel less competent in the earlier period, because then when I teach theories of gender in Oslo, which is one of my areas now. I start actually in the prehistoric period, showing the Cycladic art and various, so that we see only how humans are represented, and very often women, and how we do not really know the word, but the earliest texts also have this represented in a different way, and I think it's Emily Apter who has done the translation of the Odyssey, and who has been talking, not necessarily in the translation, but she's been talking about how she wants to translate and not imply or to kind of move back in time the view of women that you find in the later text, because she finds that the women in the Odyssey are far more multifaceted, much more complicated, and so I keep that in mind, but it's because I'm more specialized in the later period, but I always keep it with me.
So we can
I can pose a question later on, but I couldn't help myself. Have you thought about how the notion of equality has evolved from classical antiquity till nowadays in what we define as the Western world, based on how each epoch, how each era actually answers the question what human nature is?
The short answer is...
Because, and if you allow me a comment, it seems to me that this Orwellian axiom that some animals are more equal than others is the history of Western civilization and Western societies, how they organize themselves.
I have not thought of that, so I will have to go home and think about that. Yeah, but I mean, it sounds very right, because the thinking is never independent of the material practices. I guess that's what you mean.
No, I mean the concept of what is human nature and how this affects how its society dealt with notions of equality.
Well, I'll have to think of that. Yeah.
No, it's philosophically intriguing.
If we don't have any more comments, so we can continue in the next room. We have a little modest reception prepared for our dear Jorunn. Thank you so much again. And we hope to see more of you under your capacity as Oslo professor, research,
yeah.
and a lot of new projects we hope to see at the So please join us.